My name is Daniel Reyes. I'm 34 years old, and for 6 years I believed my marriage was quiet in the good way, the way a house is quiet when everyone inside it is safe. I was wrong. It was a Tuesday in March, and I remember the smell of burnt coffee because I'd forgotten the pot on the warmer for 20 minutes while I sat at the kitchen table scrolling through nothing. My wife, Priya, walked in wearing the gray robe she always wore on mornings she didn't have court, her hair still damp, and she set her phone down on the counter face up while she reached for a mug. That's when I saw it. A text preview, still glowing on the lock screen, from a name saved simply as M. It read, "Tell him it's for the marriage. He'll believe anything if you cry a little." I didn't move. I didn't say anything. I just watched the screen dim on its own, the way a light goes out when nobody's touched the switch, and I felt something in my chest go very still and very cold at the same time. Priya turned around, saw me looking at the counter, and said, "You're up early." I said nothing. I picked up my coffee, and it tasted like ash, though I don't think that was the coffee's fault. 3 days earlier, Priya had told me she wanted to try for a baby. She'd cried when she said it, real tears, the kind that catch in your throat and make your voice crack in the middle of a sentence. She said she'd been thinking about it for months, that she was scared to bring it up because we'd struggled, that the last 4 months of no intimacy between us had been about her own fear, not about me. I had believed her. I had held her on the couch that night and told her I understood, that we could go slow, that whatever she needed from me, she could have. I had felt, for the first time in a long while, like we were going to be okay. Before I tell you what happened next, and before I tell you who M was and what he meant by he'll believe anything, tell me, what time is it where you're watching this from? Where are you watching from? What's the weather like there? I'm curious how far this story is going to travel. I went to work that day like nothing had happened. I sell commercial insurance out of an office on the 9th floor of a building downtown, and I remember sitting through a meeting about a client's fleet policy without hearing a single word anyone said. My hands were steady. That surprised me. I kept thinking they should be shaking. Instead, I sat there running the math of our marriage backward, trying to find the exact day the numbers had stopped adding up. I didn't confront her that night. I told myself I needed to be sure before I said anything, that a single text preview wasn't proof of anything except that I'd read 4 words out of context. That's the story I told myself, anyway. The truth is I was afraid. Afraid that if I asked the question out loud, I wouldn't be able to unhear the answer. Priya and I had built what looked, from the outside, like a good life. We'd bought a house in Maple Grove 2 years earlier, a 3-bedroom with a yard that backed onto a stretch of undeveloped land, and we'd talked more than once about which room would become a nursery. She was a paralegal at a family law firm downtown, sharp and organized in a way that made her very good at her job and, I used to think, very good at being my wife. She remembered things I forgot. She kept lists. She was, in the language she liked to use, a planner. That night I lay next to her in bed and listened to her breathe, slow and even, the breathing of someone with nothing on her conscience, and I thought about the 4 months before that Tuesday. 4 months of her turning away from me at night, of small excuses, of a distance I'd told myself was normal, the kind every long marriage moves through. I thought about how quickly that distance had ended the moment she said the word baby. I didn't have a clean answer for what I was feeling. Part of me wanted to believe I'd misread the text. Part of me already knew I hadn't. The next morning, I did something I'd never done in 6 years of marriage. I opened her laptop while she was in the shower, and I looked. I found the account first. Not an affair in the way I'd braced myself for, no hotel receipts, no restaurant reservations, but a shared document, titled Simply Plan, dated 4 months back to the exact week she'd stopped reaching for me at night. I opened it with my thumb hovering over the trackpad like it might burn me. The document had 2 names at the top. Priya's. And a name I didn't recognize, Marcus Chen. Below the names was a list. A calendar. A set of terms that read less like love and more like a contract, and at the bottom, one line that made my stomach fold in on itself: Daniel doesn't need to know the donor. He just needs to think it's his. I sat there in the quiet of our kitchen, the shower still running upstairs, and I understood that the woman I had comforted on our couch 3 nights earlier, the one who cried real tears about wanting a family with me, had been reading from a script the whole time. I closed the laptop. I made myself a fresh pot of coffee. And I started, very calmly, to plan. I want to be honest about something before I go further. In the days after I found that document, I didn't cry, and I didn't yell. I know that surprises people when I tell this part of the story. I think it surprised Priya too, later, when she finally understood how long I'd known before I said a single word. But that's not who I am. My father was a claims adjuster for 31 years, and the one thing he taught me, without ever meaning to turn it into a life lesson, was that anger without documentation gets you nowhere. So instead of confronting her that morning, I made coffee, kissed her on the cheek when she came downstairs in her towel, and told her I loved her. She smiled and said it back. I remember thinking that smile would stay with me for a long time, and it has, just not in the way she probably hoped. To understand how we got to that kitchen, you have to go back further than 4 months. You have to go back to the beginning, because betrayals like this one don't start on the day you find out. They start years earlier, in small moments nobody thinks to write down. Priya and I met in 2019 at a mutual friend's engagement party in St. Paul. She was 28 then, finishing her paralegal certification, sharp-tongued in a way I found charming before I understood it could also be a weapon. Her mother, Meena, had immigrated from Pune in the 80s and raised Priya mostly alone after her father left when Priya was 9. I only mention this because it matters later. Priya used to say her father's leaving was the reason she needed to control the variables in her own life. At the time, I thought that was a strength. I told my brother once that I loved how Priya never let anything happen to her by accident. I didn't understand yet what that meant when applied to a marriage. We got married in October 2020, a small ceremony of 40 people because of the pandemic, at a venue in Stillwater that smelled like cedar and rain. My mother cried through the whole thing. Priya's mother did not attend. She and Priya had a falling out that year over money, something involving a loan Meena had asked for and Priya had refused, and the two of them didn't speak again until Meena passed away in 2022. I bring this up because I think it explains something about Priya I didn't want to see back then. She was capable of cutting people off completely, without warning, when they stopped being useful to her. I thought that only applied to her mother. I was wrong about that too. The first 2 years of our marriage were good, or at least I believed they were. We had routines. Friday nights were takeout and a movie. She kept a small notebook, I used to tease her about it, where she wrote down bills, appointments, birthdays, anything that needed tracking. I found it endearing. Organized. I didn't think much about the fact that I never saw inside that notebook, that it lived in her bag and not on the kitchen counter with everything else. It was in 2023 that I met Marcus Chen for the first time, though I didn't know then what he would come to mean. He was a colleague of Priya's at the law firm, an associate attorney 5 years younger than her, tall, soft-spoken, the kind of man who remembers your coffee order after meeting you once. We had dinner with him and his then-girlfriend twice that year. He complimented my watch. He asked me detailed questions about my job that made me feel, at the time, flattered rather than studied. Looking back, I think he was doing reconnaissance. I think he was very good at it. Priya and Marcus started working closely together in early 2025, on a custody case, she told me, one that required long hours and weekend prep. I remember the exact night she told me this because it was our anniversary, and she apologized for having to leave early to meet him at the office. I told her it was fine. I told her I understood the demands of her job. I want to be clear that I am not telling you this story to paint myself as naive, though I understand if that's how it sounds. I'm telling you because I think most betrayals don't happen in a single dramatic moment. They happen in 100 small permissions, granted one at a time, by people who trust each other and have no reason yet not to. By the summer of 2025, the late nights had become a pattern. I noticed, of course I noticed, but I filed it under the category of things a supportive husband doesn't make a big deal out of. Priya would come home smelling faintly of a cologne that wasn't mine, cedar and something citrus, sharp, and tell me it was from the office, that half the associates wore something similar, that firms like theirs ran the AC too cold and everyone huddled near the conference room where a partner kept a diffuser going. I believed her. I want to say that plainly, without excuses. I believed almost everything she told me for the better part of a year. It was around September that the intimacy in our marriage started to change. Not all at once, there was no single conversation where she said, "I don't want this anymore." It was smaller than that. She started going to bed before me. She started saying she was tired in a tone that discouraged follow-up. When I tried to talk about it, in October, she cried and said she felt disconnected from her own body, that work had been consuming her, that she needed time. I held her that night the way I held her 4 months later on the couch, and I told her the same thing both times, whatever you need, take it. I didn't know I was being managed. I thought I was being patient. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't know until I opened that laptop in March, was that somewhere in that same stretch of months, Priya and Marcus had started having a very different kind of conversation. Not about custody cases. About timelines. About donor compatibility, cycle tracking, and what Priya's document called, in a phrase I still can't read without my jaw tightening, the Daniel variable, meaning me, meaning how to manage what I would and wouldn't be told, meaning how long they thought they could keep the plan running before I noticed anything at all. I didn't know any of that yet, sitting in our kitchen with my coffee going cold. All I knew was that the woman upstairs getting dressed for work had cried on our couch 4 days earlier and asked me to give her one more chance to be close to me again, and that somewhere in a shared document with another man's name on it, she had already decided what that closeness was going to cost me. I didn't tell anyone what I'd found. Not my brother, not my closest friend from college, not even my father, who I usually called on Sunday mornings just to talk about nothing in particular. I told myself I was protecting Priya's privacy until I understood the full picture. Looking back, I think I was protecting myself from having to say the words out loud, because saying them would make it real in a way that reading a document on a laptop, somehow, hadn't fully managed to do. 2 days after I found the plan document, I did something I'm not proud of, though I've made peace with it. I bought a small voice-activated recorder from an electronics store off Highway 36, paid cash, and left it charging in my car overnight. I'm not a person who does things like that. I want you to understand that. But by that point I already suspected that whatever conversations Priya was having about this, with Marcus, or with anyone else, weren't happening over text where I might stumble across them again. She was too careful for that. I needed something I couldn't unsee, something that would hold up if it ever came to that, though I didn't yet know what that would look like. The following Thursday, March 20th, Priya told me she was meeting a friend named Sarah for dinner at a restaurant in Uptown. I knew this wasn't true almost immediately, because Priya doesn't have a friend named Sarah, she has a friend named Sarah, no H, who lives in Chicago and whom she hadn't seen in over a year. I said nothing. I told her to have fun. I watched her car pull out of the driveway at 6:40 p.m., and at 6:52, I received a notification from the banking app we shared, the one we'd set up years earlier to track our joint savings for the house. A charge had posted at a hotel on France Avenue. $214.60. Not a restaurant. A Marriott. I want to pause here and tell you something about the version of myself that sat in his car that night, 2 blocks from that hotel, because I think it matters. I did not go inside. I did not knock on a door. I sat in the parking structure across the street with the recorder from my own bedroom nightstand in my jacket pocket, the one I'd used, foolishly, hopefully, months earlier when we'd talked about trying counseling, and I watched people come and go from the lobby doors for 40 minutes before I made myself leave. I told myself, driving home, that the charge could have an explanation. I told myself this even though some part of me already knew there wasn't one. Priya came home at 11:15 that night. She smelled like cedar and something citrus, the same smell from the year before, the smell I had let myself stop noticing because noticing it meant asking a question I wasn't ready to hear the answer to. She told me dinner ran long, that Sarah, she used the name Sarah this time, correcting herself so smoothly I almost admired it, had a lot going on and needed to talk. I said that sounded hard on her. I meant something else entirely. The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years and drove to the county recorder's office instead. I want to explain why. Priya's document had referenced something called the donor agreement in passing, a phrase that sent a specific kind of cold through me, because in 6 years of marriage, no one had ever used the word donor around me in any context. I didn't know what it meant yet, whether Marcus intended to be a biological father in some official capacity, whether there was money involved, whether this was something they'd discussed with a clinic. I needed to know what I was actually looking at before I did anything else. I am, by nature, a person who needs the full shape of a problem before I can respond to it. That instinct, more than anything else, is what carried me through the next 8 months. I found nothing at the recorder's office, which I expected. Whatever this was, it hadn't been formalized anywhere public yet. But on my way out, sitting in the parking lot, I made a decision that changed the entire shape of what I was doing. I stopped trying to catch Priya in the act of anything. I started trying to understand the plan itself, from the beginning, in writing, in her own words. That night, while she slept, I went back into the laptop. This time I didn't just read the document once and close it. I made copies, screenshots, timestamped, saved to a private cloud folder I created under an email address she didn't know existed. I found earlier drafts of the plan document, versions with tracked changes still visible. In one, dated back to November, Marcus had written a comment in the margin, "Are we sure he won't ask for a paternity test? Because if he does, this falls apart fast." Priya's reply, timestamped 4 minutes later, "He trusts me completely. He's not going to ask. That's the whole point of picking him." I sat with that sentence for a long time. That's the whole point of picking him. Not loving him. Picking him. Like I was a variable selected for a specific property, trust, and the absence of suspicion, rather than a person she'd built a life with. I found more that night. A message thread going back to August, in which Priya described me to Marcus using details from our marriage I recognized instantly and painfully. The fact that I'd always wanted kids more than she had. The fact that I'd have believed almost anything if it meant we could finally start a family. She had turned my own hope into a tool. In one message, dated September 14th, she wrote, "He'll be so happy he won't ask questions. Guilt does the rest. I just have to cry once and he folds." I closed the laptop that night and sat in the dark of our living room for a long time, listening to the house settle, thinking about every time in the past 6 months I had folded, exactly as she predicted, exactly on schedule. The night on the couch. The morning with the coffee. All of it accounted for in advance, in a document with tracked changes, by 2 people discussing me the way you'd discuss a policy you were trying to get approved. I didn't confront her the next morning either. By that point, I understood something important. If I moved too early, on instinct, I would lose. Priya was organized, careful, 3 steps ahead in every version of this I could imagine. If I wanted the truth to matter, if I wanted consequences that would actually hold, I needed more than screenshots and a hotel receipt. I needed a paper trail no lawyer could argue around. So the next morning, over the same kitchen table, I told her I loved her, that I'd been thinking a lot about what she'd said, and that I wanted to start trying for a baby too. I watched her face soften with something that looked, horribly, like relief. "Really," she said. "You mean it?" "I mean it," I said, and for the first time in this whole story, I understood exactly what it felt like to lie to my wife's face and feel nothing but calm. I want to explain the decision I made that morning, because I know it might sound cold, even manipulative, and I've turned it over in my head more times than I can count since. I decided to let Priya believe the plan was working. Not because I wanted to punish her by playing along, though I won't pretend some part of me didn't feel a grim satisfaction in it, but because I understood, with total clarity, that the only way to expose something this carefully built was to let it keep building until it collapsed under its own weight, in front of witnesses, with documents nobody could argue away. The next 3 weeks were the strangest of my marriage. Priya was warmer to me than she'd been in over a year. She made dinner on nights she used to work late. She started talking about names, not seriously, she said, just for fun, and mentioned that she liked Arjun for a boy, a detail I filed away because I remembered from the document that Marcus's middle name was Arjun. I said it was a nice name. I meant something else entirely, the way I'd started meaning something else in almost every sentence I gave her now. On April 8th, I hired a lawyer. Not a divorce attorney yet. I wasn't ready to say that word out loud, even to myself, but a family law consultant named Rebecca Solano, referred to me by a coworker who'd gone through a difficult divorce 2 years earlier. I met her in a small office on Marquette Avenue with a window that looked out over a parking ramp, and I laid out everything I had, the screenshots, the hotel charge, the track changes document, the message where Priya had written guilt does the rest. I just have to cry once and he folds. Rebecca read through it in near silence, occasionally making a note on a yellow legal pad, and when she finished, she looked up at me and said something I've never forgotten. Mr. Reyes, most of what you've shown me is going to matter far less in a courtroom than it matters in your own decision-making. Minnesota is a no-fault divorce state. Adultery doesn't automatically get you more of the marital assets. But, she said, tapping the printed document, if there's an actual paternity deception involved, if she intends for you to raise and financially support a child that isn't biologically yours, believing it is, that's not just infidelity. Depending on how it plays out, that could open up fraud claims, and it absolutely will matter for custody and support determinations if a child is eventually involved. She told me to keep documenting everything, dated and time-stamped, and to say nothing to Priya that could be construed as coercion or entrapment. Let her make her own choices, Rebecca said. Just make sure you can prove what those choices were. 10 days later, on April 18th, I found the first financial thread. I want to be precise about how I found it, because precision mattered to Rebecca, and it matters to this story. Priya had, without realizing it, left our joint credit card app open on the iPad we kept in the kitchen for recipes and grocery lists. I saw a pending charge for $1,850 to a business listed only as Twin Cities Fertility Partners. I hadn't been to any fertility clinic. I hadn't signed any consent form. When I looked up the charge later that week using the transaction reference number, I found it corresponded to an initial consultation and semen analysis, for Marcus Chin, not for me. She was using our joint account to pay for another man's fertility testing. I didn't say anything about the charge. Instead, I opened a separate account at a credit union across town, quietly, and began redirecting a portion of my paycheck there under the label emergency savings, a phrase vague enough that Priya never asked a follow-up question. By early May, I had moved $6,200 into that account. I want to be honest, this wasn't vindictiveness. Rebecca had told me plainly that if this ended in divorce, I would need resources that weren't entangled in an account Priya had access to, and that protecting myself financially was not the same thing as punishing her. On May 2nd, I found the clinic paperwork itself, this time in a manila folder tucked inside a filing cabinet in our home office, behind old tax returns from 2021. It was a donor insemination consent packet, partially filled out, with Priya's signature already on it dated April 22nd. Under intended legal father, the space was left blank. Under known donor identification, Marcus Chen's full name was printed in Priya's handwriting, Marcus Arjun Chen, born September 3, 1991. I photographed every page. I emailed the photographs to myself and to Rebecca that same night. The following week brought the detail that finally broke something loose in me, not sadness this time, but a kind of clarity I hadn't expected. On May 9th, I overheard Priya on a phone call in the garage, where she sometimes went for privacy, believing the door muffled sound more than it actually does. I stood on the other side of the drywall with my hand flat against it, listening to her tell Marcus, in a voice I recognized as her closing argument voice, the one she used on difficult clients. He already thinks it's happening because he wants it. I told him I want a baby, and he heard I love you underneath it, because that's what he's always wanted to hear. We just need 6 more weeks before the procedure, and by then it won't matter what he thinks he remembers about timelines. It won't matter what he thinks he remembers about timelines. She was already planning, months in advance, how to manage what I would later question about the child's conception date, in case I ever tried to do the math myself. I walked back into the kitchen before she finished the call. When she came inside a few minutes later, cheeks a little flushed from the cold, she smiled at me and asked what I wanted for dinner. I told her I felt like Thai food, the place on Grand Avenue we used to go to on our anniversary. She said that sounded perfect. I watched her order pad Thai with extra peanuts, her usual, completely at ease, completely unaware that 4 feet away from her, sitting with his own menu open and unread, her husband had just decided, with total finality, exactly how this was going to end. That night, after she fell asleep, I called Rebecca's after-hours line and left a message asking her to draft the paperwork for full legal separation, effective immediately, and to explain to me exactly how, legally, carefully, and in a way that couldn't be challenged, I could make sure Priya found out that I knew everything at a moment and in a place she couldn't control, the same way she had spent the last 8 months trying to control every moment of mine. Rebecca called me back the next morning at 8:15, before I'd even finished my coffee, and told me something that reframed everything I'd been building toward. Daniel, she said, before we talk about separation paperwork, I need to ask you something directly. Has your wife asked you, at any point, to sign anything, a birth certificate acknowledgement, a paternity affidavit, anything with your name on it as father? I told her no, not yet. Good, she said. Because if she gets you to sign a voluntary paternity acknowledgement before this child is born, believing the child is biologically yours, you could end up legally obligated to that child for 18 years, regardless of what a DNA test later shows. Minnesota gives you a narrow window to rescind that kind of acknowledgement, 60 days, or before a court proceeding related to the child, whichever comes first. After that window closes, courts are extremely reluctant to let you out of it, because judges care more about a child's stability than about how the child was conceived. So the timeline actually matters more than you think. We need to move before there's a signature, not after. That conversation changed the pace of everything. I stopped thinking of this as something I could let unfold slowly and started thinking of it as something with a countdown attached. On May 14th, Rebecca helped me retain a private investigator, a woman named Denise Okafor who'd spent 9 years with the Hennepin County Sheriff's Office before going independent. I want to explain why we brought in a third party at this point, because it wasn't about gathering more evidence of the affair. I already had more than enough of that. It was about something Rebecca called chain of custody for the narrative. Her words. She explained that screenshots I'd taken myself, from a laptop I didn't technically have permission to access, could be challenged later as invasive or even inadmissible, depending on how things escalated. Denise's job was to independently corroborate what I already knew, through observation and public records, so that none of it depended solely on me having gone through my wife's private accounts. Denise confirmed within 8 days what I already suspected. Marcus Chen had visited Twin Cities Fertility Partners on 3 separate occasions between April 18th and May 6th. She obtained, through entirely legal means, public parking garage camera footage from a structure she had prior authorization to review as part of an unrelated case, cross-referenced with vehicle registration. Timestamps placing his car there on all 3 dates, alongside Priya's car on 2 of them. She also found something I hadn't known. Marcus was still, at that time, listed as engaged to his girlfriend from the year before, a woman named Elise Kowalski, according to a save-the-date announcement Elise had posted publicly in March, for a wedding planned for October. That detail changed something for me. I had assumed, wrongly, that whatever this was between Priya and Marcus, it was at least honest between the 2 of them, that they'd chosen each other and I was simply the person left outside that choice. But it wasn't that at all. Marcus was engaged to someone else the entire time. Whatever Priya thought she and Marcus had, it seemed clear that at least one of them was lying to two people at once. I didn't tell Priya any of this. I kept coming home for dinner. I kept saying I felt hopeful about us. On May 20th, she told me, tearfully, over pasta she'd made from scratch, that she thought she might be pregnant, that she'd taken a test that morning and it was faint but there. She held my hand across the table and said, "I know it's been a hard year for us, Daniel. But I really think this is going to fix things." I told her I was happy. I asked her when she thought it happened, doing the math out loud, gently, the way any excited husband might. She said she wasn't sure exactly, maybe 3 weeks back, and changed the subject quickly to whether we should paint the nursery yellow or green. 3 weeks back placed conception around April 29th. I had been in Milwaukee for a work conference from April 26th through May 1st. I had the hotel folio, the rental car receipt, and 4 coworkers who could confirm it. Rebecca filed the paperwork for legal separation on May 28th, but we agreed to hold the formal serving of documents until after Priya's OB appointment, scheduled for June 3rd, where a first trimester dating ultrasound would establish, with far more precision than Priya's own guess, an estimated conception date. I want to be honest that this felt cruel to wait for, and I asked Rebecca more than once whether we needed to. She told me plainly, "You're not creating the truth, Daniel. You're just waiting for the moment it becomes undeniable to everyone, including her." On June 3rd, Priya came home from that appointment glowing, holding a black and white ultrasound photo, telling me the doctor had put her at 7 weeks along, with an estimated conception window between April 26th and April 30th. I looked at that photo for a long time. Then I looked at her, and for the first time in 3 months, I let her see something honest on my face. Though she misread it completely, she thought it was joy. That night, after she went to bed, I emailed Rebecca the ultrasound date, the conception window, and my Milwaukee travel documentation, and I asked her one question: "How soon can we do this?" Rebecca replied within an hour. She'd already drafted a plan. There would be a scheduled mediation session, required under our county's process before any contested filing, set for June 20th. Both Priya and I would be present, along with our attorneys. Rebecca told me this would be the moment, not a screaming match in our kitchen, not a scene at a family dinner, but a room with a table, a court-appointed mediator, transcripts, and Priya's own attorney sitting beside her, forced to watch her explanation collapse in real time against documents she couldn't argue were fabricated, because half of them were her own words, time-stamped in her own handwriting. I spent the next 17 days doing something I hadn't expected, grieving quietly, in private, for the marriage I'd once believed I had, even while I finished preparing to end it. I want to say that part honestly, because I think people expect me to say I felt only anger by that point, and that wouldn't be true. I loved her, or I loved who I believed she was, for 6 years. Both things were true at once. I did not have a clean answer for how to hold them together, and I still don't, not completely, even now. The 17 days between the ultrasound and the mediation were the quietest I've ever lived through, and I mean that in the most literal sense. I stopped talking more than I needed to. Priya, still glowing with a pregnancy she believed I thought was mine, filled the silence for both of us. She started a Pinterest board for the nursery. She asked me, one night while we were brushing our teeth, whether I thought Arav was a name I could see myself calling out across a playground someday. I told her it was a beautiful name. I did not tell her that Arav had been the name on a napkin in the plan document, one of 3 names Marcus had suggested back in January. I kept the recorder in my nightstand, though I never used it again after that first hotel night. I didn't need to. By June, Rebecca had everything she needed in writing, in documents, in dates that lined up with a precision no accusation of mine could have matched. What I hadn't expected was how strange it felt to keep loving someone, in the ordinary daily sense of making her tea the way she liked it or remembering to feed the neighbor's cat when she forgot, while simultaneously building the case that would end things. I want to say I felt like two different men living in the same house. Some nights I still believe that's exactly what I was. On June 12, 8 days before the mediation, Priya's mother-in-law, Marcus's mother, a woman named Linda Chin I had never met, called our home phone by mistake, apparently believing she was dialing Marcus's cell. Priya wasn't home. I answered. Linda, warm and a little rushed, said she was calling to confirm details for October, said something about the venue deposit for Marcus and Elise's big day, and it took her a full 10 seconds of my silence before she realized she had the wrong number, apologized, and hung up. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time after that call. It was one thing to have the engagement announcement Denise had found online. It was another to hear, in real time, from a mother excited about her son's wedding in 4 months, that the man having a baby with my wife had every intention of marrying someone else that same October, 3 months after Priya's due date. I called Rebecca that night. She told me to save it, log the date and time, and let it sit. Everything you're finding, she said, is just more weight on the same scale. You don't need to add anything to the case at this point, Daniel. You need to survive the next 8 days without doing anything that makes you look less credible than the evidence already makes her look. Those 8 days tested that advice more than any other part of this story. On June 15th, Priya asked me, casually, over dinner, whether I'd started looking into paternity leave policies at my office. I told her I had. I hadn't. On June 17th, she showed me a onesie she'd bought, cream-colored, with a small embroidered elephant on the front, and asked if I liked it. I told her it was perfect. It was the truth, the onesie was perfect. Nothing else in that sentence was. The night before the mediation, I couldn't sleep. I lay next to Priya, listening to her breathe the same slow, even breaths I'd listened to back in March, the night I first opened her laptop, and I thought about how much had changed in 3 months without her knowing any of it had changed at all. I thought about the sensory detail I keep coming back to in this story, that cedar and citrus smell, the one I'd talked myself out of noticing for over a year. It had stopped bothering me by June. Not because I'd made peace with it, but because I'd stopped needing it to mean anything. I already knew everything the smell could have told me, and more. The morning of June 20th, I put on the navy suit I usually reserve for client presentations, and Priya, getting ready in the next room for what she believed was a routine mediation about communication issues. The phrase her own attorney had apparently used to describe the session to her, which told me Priya still had no idea what was actually coming, asked me if I was nervous. A little, I said. That, at least, was completely true. We drove to the mediation center separately, at Rebecca's instruction, arriving 11 minutes apart. The building was on Wabasha Street, a squat brick office with a conference room on the second floor that smelled faintly of dry erase markers and burnt drip coffee, not unlike the coffee I'd let go cold back in March. I remember thinking, sitting down at that long table, that the smell felt almost like a bookend, though I didn't say that out loud to anyone. The mediator, a woman named Caroline, opened the session with the standard framing, that mediation was meant to help both parties reach a fair, mutually acceptable resolution outside of a courtroom, that everything discussed would remain confidential unless both parties agreed otherwise. Priya sat across from me, her attorney beside her, a man named Todd Bregman who I'd later learn had handled almost exclusively straightforward, amicable separations in his career and had, by his own later admission in a filed statement, been given no indication from his client that infidelity, let alone the situation involving a third party's paternity, was part of what this case involved. Rebecca opened by stating, calmly and without inflection, that this was not, in fact, a mediation about communication issues, and that my client, meaning me, had retained counsel regarding grounds that included financial misconduct involving joint marital assets and a matter of contested paternity that both parties would need to address before any further discussion of custody or support could proceed. I watched Priya's face change in that moment. Not dramatically. Just a small, sharp shift around her eyes, the look of someone doing very fast math and not liking the answer. She turned to Todd, whispered something. He asked for a 5-minute recess. When we reconvened, Rebecca placed a folder on the table, not thick, just 11 pages, carefully selected, and said, "I'd like to walk through some documents with the room, if that's all right," starting with a shared file titled Plan, created on November 3rd of last year. Priya's hand, I noticed, had gone very still on the table in front of her. Rebecca laid out the first page and turned it so it faced Priya and Todd rather than Carol, which I understood later was deliberate. She wanted Priya to see her own words before anyone else in the room did, so there could be no claim afterward that she hadn't recognized them. Priya's eyes moved across the page, and I watched the exact moment she reached the line about the Daniel variable. Her jaw tightened. She didn't look up. "This is a private document," Todd said, recovering first. "I'll need to understand how it was obtained before we treat it as admissible in any capacity." "It was obtained from a shared household device, accessible to both parties, during the course of the marriage," Rebecca said evenly. "We're not asking Carol to rule on admissibility today. This is mediation, not trial. I'm simply asking that the room acknowledge what's in front of us before we move forward with any proposal regarding custody, support, or division of assets, because those proposals depend heavily on facts my client has a right to have addressed directly." She turned to Priya. "Priya, is this a document you wrote, in collaboration with Marcus Chen, beginning in November of last year?" Priya didn't answer right away. Carol, the mediator, sat very still, her pen resting on her legal pad, clearly recalibrating what kind of session this had actually become. Finally Priya said, quietly, "I want to speak to my attorney privately." "You can," Rebecca said. "But I'd ask that before you do, everyone in this room understand the timeline we're working with. Priya is currently 7 weeks and 6 days pregnant, as of an ultrasound performed on June 3rd, placing conception between April 26th and April 30th. Daniel was in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, for a work conference from April 26th through May 1st, and can provide hotel, travel, and corroborating witness documentation for the entirety of that window." I watched something happen to Priya's face that I will remember for the rest of my life. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was the look of someone watching a structure she'd spent 8 months building come apart floor by floor, faster than she could stop it, and understanding, in real time, that there was no version of the next sentence that would put it back together. "I can explain the timeline," Priya said, her voice thinner than I'd ever heard it. "I'd like to hear it," Rebecca said. "But before you do, I want to enter one more document into the discussion." She placed a second page on the table, the donor insemination consent packet from Twin Cities Fertility Partners, Priya's signature dated April 22nd, Marcus Arjun Chen's name printed under known donor identification. "This is dated 8 days before the earliest possible conception window your OB's office established. I'd like to understand how a signed donor consent form involving a named third party predates a pregnancy you've represented to your husband, in writing and verbally, as being his." Todd Bregman put his pen down. I watched him look at his own client for a long moment, something unreadable crossing his face, and I understood later, when he withdrew from representing her 2 weeks afterward, that this was likely the exact moment he realized he'd walked into this session believing one story and was now sitting across from a different one entirely. Priya's composure, the thing I'd watched her maintain through 6 years of marriage, through arguments and stress and even her mother's funeral, finally broke. Not loudly. She didn't shout. She put both hands flat on the table, took a breath that shook audibly, and said, "I didn't know how to tell you I didn't want this to be your child, Daniel. I didn't know how to say that and still keep you. So I thought if I could just get through the pregnancy, if I could just get you attached before you found any reason to ask questions, it wouldn't matter anymore. You'd love the baby. You always said you wanted kids more than I did. I thought that would be enough to make it not matter." "It would have mattered," I said. It was the first full sentence I'd spoken since the recess. "It would have mattered for 18 years, every single day, whether I ever found out or not. You didn't protect me from something painful, Priya. You just decided I didn't get to know the truth about my own life." Carol, the mediator, finally spoke, her voice careful and measured in the way I imagine you learn after years of sitting in rooms exactly like this one. I want to pause here, she said, because what's being discussed has moved well beyond the scope of a standard marital mediation. Given the paternity question and what appears to be a documented, premeditated concealment, I'd strongly recommend both parties consult separately with counsel regarding not just divorce proceedings but the legal framework around the child's paternity determination going forward, ideally including a court-ordered or voluntary DNA test after birth, and clarity on financial matters, including the joint account expenditures referenced in Ms. Reyes's. She paused, glancing at her notes in Priya's own document. That was the moment Priya asked, quietly, whether Marcus knew what was happening in this room. Rebecca told her that Marcus's fiancée, Elise Kowalski, had been contacted 3 days earlier by Denise Okafor's office, as part of standard corroborating outreach, and made aware of the fertility clinic visits and the child's likely paternity. Priya's face went white. You told her, Priya said, and for the first time in the entire session, there was real fear in her voice, not for the marriage, I think, but for something else, the last piece of this that she still believed was hers to control. I didn't tell her anything, Rebecca said. A licensed investigator conducted a legal inquiry as part of an active case. What Elise chooses to do with that information is entirely her own decision. I understand she's since postponed her wedding, currently scheduled for October 17th, though I have no further details beyond that. I sat there, in that dry erase marker smelling room, and watched my wife of 6 years absorb the fact that the plan she'd spent 8 months building, the plan that had a name for the baby, a nursery color, a version of me who would never ask hard questions, had collapsed not because I'd screamed at her across our kitchen table, but because I'd waited, quietly, methodically, until it collapsed on its own, in front of witnesses who could write down exactly how it happened. The mediation session ended without an agreement that day, which Carol explained was fairly common once a case revealed complications beyond its original scope. What it produced instead was a formal record, a signed acknowledgement from both parties confirming which documents had been reviewed, a referral to family court given the contested paternity issue, and a recommendation that both Priya and I retain separate counsel moving forward, which we'd already done. I drove home alone that afternoon, and for the first time in 3 months, I didn't have to manage my face into an expression I didn't feel. I sat in my car in our driveway for almost 20 minutes before I went inside. Priya didn't come home that night. She texted at 9:40 p.m. to say she was staying with a coworker, and I didn't ask which one, because by that point I already knew the answer wouldn't be Marcus. Rebecca had told me that afternoon that Denise's office had confirmed Elise Kowalski had, in fact, ended the engagement outright that same day, not merely postponed the wedding, after receiving documentation of the fertility clinic visits alongside a copy of a text exchange between Marcus and Priya dated as recently as June 9, 11 days before the mediation, in which Marcus had written, "We just need to get through the next few months without either of them figuring it out." Over the following 6 weeks, the practical unwinding of my marriage happened with a kind of institutional slowness I hadn't expected. Rebecca filed the formal petition for dissolution of marriage on June 24. Because Minnesota requires equitable, not necessarily equal, division of marital property, and because Priya's own documented financial misconduct, the $1,850 fertility clinic charge and several smaller ones Denise later traced, totaling $3,240 in joint funds spent on expenses related to Marcus's paternity testing and clinic visits between January and May, became part of the formal record. Rebecca argued successfully for a reimbursement provision in the eventual settlement. Priya's attorney, a new one by then, a woman named Patricia Okonkwo who took over after Todd withdrew, didn't contest it. There wasn't much room to. The paternity matter moved on a separate but connected track. Given the circumstances, and given that Marcus himself, once the situation became public within his own firm, where he and Priya both still worked, in the same office, on different floors, an arrangement that became untenable within about 3 weeks, voluntarily agreed to a court-recognized paternity acknowledgement once the child was born, which the judge overseeing the family court matter, a woman named Judge Elaine Petrov, noted in a hearing on July 30th, was the only element of this case handled with any candor from the outset. I want to be clear that I never sought custody of or financial responsibility for the child. Rebecca made sure the record reflected, unambiguously, that I had never signed any paternity acknowledgement and had no legal obligation toward a child I was not biologically related to and had not consented to raise. That protection, more than anything else in the entire case, was the reason Rebecca had pushed so hard to move before Priya's original plan could reach its conclusion. Marcus, for his part, lost more than the engagement. His firm, the same firm employing Priya, opened an internal review after Elise, in the aftermath of the broken engagement, forwarded portions of the plan document and the text exchanges to the firm's HR department, apparently believing, correctly, that a senior associate having an affair with a colleague while both were assigned to the same active case files raised conflict of interest concerns beyond the personal fallout. The firm's review, completed in early August, found that Marcus had, on 4 separate occasions between February and April, billed hours to the firm's client accounts for time that overlapped with personal meetings related to the fertility clinic visits. A detail Denise uncovered by cross-referencing his submitted timesheets against the parking garage footage timestamps she'd already gathered. That finding alone, separate from any personal scandal, was enough for the firm to terminate his employment on August 14, citing billing fraud. He was later reported to the Minnesota Office of Lawyers' Professional Responsibility, and as of the time I'm telling you this, that inquiry was still pending, though a formal complaint had been filed. Priya resigned from the same firm on August 20, 6 days after Marcus's termination, before the firm could take any formal action against her directly, though I understand from a former mutual acquaintance that her departure was, in practice, not entirely voluntary. The divorce was finalized on October 9, 4 months to the day after Linda Chen's mistaken phone call to our house. The settlement required Priya to reimburse the $3,240 in misused joint funds, split the equity in our Maple Grove house roughly according to our respective contributions with a modest adjustment in my favor given the financial misconduct finding, and formally waived any claim to spousal support, which her attorney had initially raised and then withdrawn once the full financial record was entered. I moved out of the house in September, into a 2-bedroom apartment closer to my office, and Priya kept the house temporarily, planning to sell it once the baby was born, given that neither of us could afford to buy the other out entirely. I remember the last time I stood in that kitchen, boxes stacked by the door, and caught, for just a moment, the faint smell of coffee from a pot Priya had made that morning. I didn't feel anything sharp anymore when I noticed it. That surprised me more than almost anything else that happened that year. I saw Priya twice more before the year ended, once at a mediated exchange of remaining property in November, and once by accident, at a grocery store in December, when she was visibly, unmistakably pregnant, standing in the produce section with a hand resting on her stomach the way people do without noticing they're doing it. We didn't speak. She saw me. I saw her. Neither of us moved toward the other, and I think we both understood, without needing to say it, that whatever conversation might have existed between us had already happened, in a conference room on Wabasha Street, in front of a mediator and 2 attorneys and 11 pages that neither of us could argue with. I want to tell you about the winter after the divorce, because I think that's the part people skip over when they imagine stories like mine. Everyone wants the confrontation, the moment the truth lands on the table and the room goes silent. Fewer people want to hear about the months afterward. When the silence doesn't end, it just moves into your apartment with you and sits on the couch. I spent most of that November and December doing very ordinary things. I unpacked boxes slowly, 1 or 2 a week, because I found I didn't have the energy to do more than that at once. I bought a coffee maker for the new apartment, a cheap one, and burned the first 2 pots the same way I'd burned that pot back in March, which felt less like an omen and more like a small, tired joke my own life was playing on me. I started running again, something I hadn't done consistently since college, along the river path near my new place, mostly because Rebecca had mentioned once, almost as an aside, that a lot of her clients found it easier to think clearly when their bodies were doing something instead of sitting still. My father, when I finally told him the full story in early November, I'd kept most of it from him during the months it was unfolding, not wanting to worry him before I had something resolved to tell, was quiet for a long time on the phone. Then he said, "You did the responsible thing the whole way through, even when it would have been easier not to." I don't know if that's entirely true. There were nights that year I wanted to throw the laptop through a window instead of documenting what was on it. But I think what he meant, and what I've come to believe myself, is that the version of justice I got wasn't loud, and it wasn't especially satisfying in the moment. It was accurate. Those aren't always the same thing, and I used to think they were. I heard, secondhand, through a mutual friend who still worked at Priya's old firm, that the child, a boy, born in late January, was healthy, and that Priya had moved in with her cousin in Egan for the first several months after the birth, since the sale of the Maple Grove house didn't close until March. I felt something complicated when I heard that, a mix of things that didn't resolve into a single clean emotion. I didn't wish harm on the child. I want to say that plainly. None of what happened was his doing, and it never occurred to me, not once, to feel anything toward him except a distant, uncomplicated hope that he'd be all right, that whatever came next for him would be shaped by people who told him the truth more often than they'd told me. Marcus, as far as I know, never regained his standing at any firm in the Twin Cities. The complaint filed with the Office of Lawyers' Professional Responsibility resulted, by the following spring, in a suspension of his license for 18 months, tied specifically to the billing fraud finding rather than the personal conduct, though I suspect both weighed on the panel's thinking more than the official record shows. Elise Kowalski, the fiancée, reached out to me once, in December, through a mutual connection, not to talk about Marcus directly but simply to say she was sorry for what I'd gone through, that she understood a little of it from her own side. I appreciated that more than I expected to. We didn't stay in touch beyond that one conversation, but I think about it sometimes, two people who never met each other, both quietly rebuilding a version of trust that had been taken from them by the same two people, in the same 8 months, without either of us knowing the other existed until it was over. By February, I'd started seeing a therapist, a decision I'd resisted for longer than I probably needed to. Her name was Dr. Wexler, and in one of our early sessions, she asked me a question I didn't have a ready answer for, whether I thought I'd ever trust someone again the way I'd trusted Priya in the beginning, before any of this happened. I told her I didn't know. I still don't know, fully. What I told her, and what I still believe, is that I don't think the goal is ever to trust exactly the same way again. I think the goal is to trust with your eyes open instead of closed, which sounds like a small distinction until you've lived through the difference. I'm not going to tell you the year that followed was a straight line toward healing, because it wasn't. There were nights in March, around the anniversary of finding the document, when I sat in my apartment and felt the whole thing rise up in me again, sharp and immediate, as if no time had passed at all. There were other nights, more of them as the months went on, when I realized an entire week had gone by without me thinking about any of it, and that realization itself felt strange, almost like a kind of grief for the grief, if that makes sense. I don't have a clean, tidy resolution to offer you about how a person moves past something like this. I think you just keep living, and the space it takes up in you gets smaller, not because it stops mattering, but because your life gets bigger around it. By that summer, a year after I'd first opened that laptop in our kitchen, I'd started dating again, slowly, cautiously, nothing serious. I found myself, more than once, watching for small things, not out of suspicion exactly, but out of a hard-earned instinct to pay attention to the gap between what someone says and what their actions actually add up to. I don't think that instinct will ever fully leave me, and I've made a kind of peace with that. I think of it now less as damage and more as something closer to literacy. I learned to read a certain kind of silence the hard way. I don't intend to unlearn it. 2 years have passed since I sat in that kitchen and watched a text preview dim on a phone screen I wasn't supposed to be looking at. I still live in the same apartment near the river, though I've since bought the unit instead of renting it, which felt like a strange kind of milestone at the time, the first major decision I made entirely on my own, with no one else's name on the paperwork. I still run that same path most mornings. I still make my coffee too strong and let it go a little too long on the burner sometimes, though I've never burned a pot since that first one in the new place, which I've come to think of, half seriously, as the last casualty of that whole year. I ran into Priya once more, this past spring, at a school fundraiser I attended with a friend whose daughter played soccer with a boy who turned out, I realized partway through the afternoon, to be Priya's son. He was almost 2 by then, a serious, round-faced kid who took his soccer very seriously for someone barely tall enough to see over the ball. Priya saw me across the field. She didn't approach, and neither did I, but she gave a small nod, the kind you give a former coworker rather than a former spouse, and I found that I could return it without anything twisting in my chest. That surprised me more than almost anything else in this story has. I don't know if what I felt in that moment was forgiveness exactly. I think it was something quieter than that, an absence of the old weight, rather than a warm replacement for it. I've thought a lot, in the 2 years since, about what I'd say to someone standing where I stood that Tuesday morning in March, coffee going cold, a text preview glowing on a countertop. I don't think I'd tell them to be less trusting. I don't think distrust is really the lesson here, even though it might look that way on the surface. What I'd tell them instead is that love without honesty isn't really love, it's just management, a set of tools someone uses to keep you calm and cooperative while they build something behind your back. I spent a long time being managed and calling it being cared for, and I don't think I'm alone in that. I think a lot of people are. Forgiveness, I've come to believe, is something you can offer freely, in your own time, for your own peace, without it ever requiring the other person to be let back into your life. Those are 2 separate decisions, and for a long time I thought they had to travel together. They don't. I forgave Priya, in the quiet, private way that doesn't need an audience or an apology to be real, sometime around the 2nd anniversary of the mediation. I did not, and will not, ever give her back the kind of access she had to me before. I think that's the sentence I'd hand to anyone going through something like this, if I could only give them one. Forgiveness is personal, but access must be earned back, and some people never earn it back, and that's allowed to be true at the same time as the forgiveness. I think about the boy sometimes, Priya's son, not often, but sometimes, usually when I see a kid his age doing something ordinary and joyful, like chasing a ball he has no real control over yet. I hope, in the uncomplicated way you hope for a stranger's child, that someone tells him the truth about his own life earlier and more completely than I was told mine. I think that's the only inheritance any of us can really ask for from the people who raise us, not a perfect story, but an honest one. So I'll leave you with the question I've been sitting with for 2 years now, the one I still don't have a fully settled answer to, because I don't think it's the kind of question that resolves cleanly, even after everything. If you found out tomorrow that someone you loved had spent months quietly deciding what you didn't get to know about your own life, not out of cruelty exactly, but because the truth was inconvenient to their plan, how long would you wait before you let yourself see it? And once you saw it, would you have the patience to build something undeniable before you said a word, or would you need the truth out loud, immediately, whatever it cost you to say it? Thank you for watching. Everything in this video is fictional, made only for entertainment and reflection, and none of it depicts any real person or event. If there's one thing I hope you take from it, it's this: healing rarely comes from the moment the truth is revealed, it comes much later, in the quiet, ordinary work of learning to trust your own eyes again.